In Pit Lane is proudly brought to you by Online Invent, website design, online marketing and software development. For more info, visit our website. Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of In Pit Lane. Well, as you can see, we're not in the studios of RMI TV once again, nor are we at the corporate headquarters of In Pit Lane beyond the suburban curtain overlooking the shores of beautiful Lake Geneva. No, we are in fact here in the home of one of Australia's most famous motorsport photographers. As I said on the program last week, if you're of my generation, the memories that you have of motorsport in the late 60s through the 70s right up to the present day, so many of them have been the product of this man's talent. His name is Ian Smith, and Ian, thank you for joining us in Pit Lane and inviting us here into your home.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Now let's talk about where did it all start?
Probably when my father bought a Ashy Pentax Spotmatic camera for me for my 21st birthday. At that stage I was working at Wheels, Sports Car World, Hot Rodding Review, and it went on from there. I started going out to the racetracks, and they gave me the film. I sent the film up to Sydney, and lo and behold, my photos appeared in Sports Car World magazine, and so that really spurred me on, and I continued on, worked there for about 3 years. I was selling advertising at the time, as well as doing some freelance photography, and so while I was there, I was Bill Tuckey was editor-in-chief, Rob Luck was editor of Sports Car World, and Tom Floyd, who ended up with Ray Berghouse, started Chevron Publishing. So I did a lot of calling on clients, including Norm Beechey, who had a speed shop out in Brunswick, and Eddie Thomas, who was into drag racing down at Fisherman's Bend, which I went down there and photographed, and but I was selling advertising at that stage, and so it kept me in contact with everyone in motorsport, even people like Kevin Donnellan, who worked for Bob Jane for some time, started selling tyres out of a Shell garage, and later I see his son's doing well still.
You mentioned a name there in Norm Beechey. I don't know. Norm was sort of finishing up his career just as I was getting involved. I remember as a kid having a white plastic crash helmet that Dad bought me from the Shell service stations at the time, that I used to ride around on my bike at about 9 years old or something with my Norm Beechey crash helmet on. Norm Beechey, tell us about his place in Australian motorsport.
Well, he was pretty much an icon. He was a real hero, equivalent to some of the footy players today. My first memories was borrowing my father's 8mm camera, going out to Calder Raceway, sitting on top of my hotted up FX Holden, and filming, and I've still got a DVD hidden somewhere, of Norm in the S4 Holden PK751, and he was also running the FX Holden along with the Neptune racing team with Peter Manton and Jim McEwen, which unfortunately just passed away recently. But that was my first probably filming I did with a 8mm camera, and then when I had the Pentax, I covered Calder on a regular basis, and later on I lashed out and bought a Hasselblad camera, which was the top of the range, and I started getting serious about photography, and I was contributing to virtually 6 magazines at that stage. There was a lot of motorsport magazines with Auto Sportsman and of Jim Abbott's and Max Dale's Racing Car News, as well as Wheels, Sports Car World I was contributing to. So that got me started, and then I started writing stories. I found that I could sell more photographs if I accompanied it with a feature story. So I ended up doing feature stories for Hot Rodding Review, Sports Car World, and that grew and grew, and I continued on until Len Shaw, who's editor-in-chief at the Age Publications Department, invited me to become assistant editor at Motor Manual, which I went over with Tim Britton, who was editor at that stage. I continued photographing, did all their covers and went out, and to me at that age it was the ultimate when you handed the keys of a GTHO or a XU1, here's the keys, take it for a week. Well, I think I was about 22 at that stage. This was the ultimate. We did a lot of one-off publications as well. There was Ford Muscle and V8 supercars. We did some track tests, and I actually was given the keys of Murray Carter's GTHO, and I did a track test out at Calder. And I always remember, it absolutely flew down the main straights, but the steering was so heavy, and I really appreciated, having going to Bathurst for some years, how they could steer these things with very heavy steering. I also did a track test of Formula Fords, Richard Knight's Formula Ford, which was sponsored by B.S. Stillwell. And that was a real steep learning curve too, because that was totally different. It was so accurate in the steering. In fact, I kept overcorrecting and spun out a couple of times, but that brought me back to my go-kart days, which again, how I really got started. My father bought me a go-kart when I was 13 years old, and just rubber tyres, and we used to run around the local park in Hawthorne, and I think that spurred me on. Yeah.
That was the start of it. So for people who don't remember the days, we'll talk about Bob Jane in a moment, but I mean, you had Norm, you had Bob, Alan Moffatt then turned up, you had Pete Gagan. I mean, in terms of, just quickly on Norm, because we're going to take a break in a second, but just quickly on Norm, do you think his role in Australian motorsport has been given the acknowledgement that it really deserves?
Oh, I posted a couple of shots on my Facebook of taken of Norm in 1967 at Winton, and instantly I had 540 likes, and the comments are still coming down. He is well and truly well remembered, and again, he comes to many of the historic race meetings.
He's had his birthday just read 91, and
yes,
as you say, still turns up. As indeed you do. We're going to take a break now here on In Pit Lane, but when we come back, we have lots more stories to talk about with Ian Smith. Don't go away. You're watching In Pit Lane, Channel 31, and the In Pit Lane YouTube channel. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In Pit Lane, where we're here at the home of Ian Smith, Australian motorsport photographer. And Ian, before the break, we talked about your early days and Norm Beechey, but one of Norm's, I suppose, his bête noire, his main rival back in those days was a guy called Bob Jane, and you had a very close association over the years with Bob Jane. Tell us about your impressions of a very complicated man, and I think sometimes a misunderstood guy. I mean, your memories of Bob Jane.
Yes, well, I worked for Bob probably over 30 years. First off at the track, where I used to supply photographs for him, and it went on and on. I visited his office quite often, Southern Motors, and saw him in operation, and he was a tough businessman, and there was a lot of grumblings from other people, but I could see that he could well and truly run a business, and in fact I ended up doing a lot of the T-Mart photography for him, opening new T-Marts, and I always remember I think the one up at Elizabeth Street, which Alan Jones took over at one stage, and I was there photographing, and Bob came in and suddenly saw some papers or things and screamed out, "Get that cleaned up, and this isn't our image," and so I could appreciate that side of him. He was very fair. We actually went out to the Melbourne Zoo at one stage because he was promoting the Bob Jane all-rounder tyre, and so we had to organise a kangaroo, and here's Bob pretending to box with a kangaroo.
Which is being his element, of course, because Bob was a boxer back in his early days,
and a cyclist too. Who was very
and there's
good.
a story behind that, which some of you might know, and we'll talk about that at another time once the statute of limitations is over.
Well, Bob got me to photograph the building of the Thunderdome. John Ecott, his pilot, because he had a Bell Jet Ranger helicopter at that stage, and virtually every month Bob would ring me up and say, "Ian, get up there," and so I'd go out, hang out the door of the Bell Jet Ranger, and photograph all these trucks, hundreds of trucks just rolling up. A lot of people inferring too that it's full of old tyres, but that's not true, because I saw this being built month after month, year after year, and I never saw any tyres being dumped there. And so on a regular basis we would photograph it, and I've still got all the negatives of it. In fact, I've raced there myself when I was running my Westfield Clubman, and going around that Thunderdome, it's a totally different experience from when you're either up in a helicopter or sitting in a grandstand. It is very, very steep, and it's quite challenging. So it was interesting to finally go around the track that I've been photographing over the years.
You mentioned, some of the photos you took for Bob, including what has become probably the most iconic photo, which is now being used basically, and still to this day is used as the logo for Bob Jane Team Arts.
That's right. Yes.
So how did that happen? I think we've heard that Philip Adams was involved in something to do with that, wasn't he?
No, he wasn't. This is the photo. This was taken at Oran Park, 1972, when Bob won the Touring Car Championship. At that stage, Bob was using a very small advertising agency called Begdow Priday, and I was contributing photographs for them and doing some work with Bob and photographing tyres in the studio and sending him in. So they saw the photo and they bought it from me for $10. Since then, various graphic artists have got it. They started hand writing or hand painting the caricature. Then they did tone dropouts, which dropped out all the halftones. So today you've got the outline, but you've still got his smile, and you've still got the curls of the hair, which is identical to the photograph that I took. So, and of course everyone says, "Gee, pity you didn't get royalties for the photo."
Very much so. So in those days he was driving the Camaro. I mean, as a racing driver, once again, I think, obviously from his time at Calder Park and as a businessman and as a character we knew Bob, but people do forget that back in his day he was one hell of a driver.
Yes. Well, in particular, like his Camaro, the battles with Norm Beechey, Alan Moffatt were iconic, especially at Calder. There were so many times they would nudge each other, and my favourite corner was Repco corner, and I got many a shot of Norm Beechey sideways, and Bob was right behind him and Alan was behind him, and they'd swap all the time.
The amazing thing about those days is when you look at today, you've got a field of supercars that are sort of, within a second, 24 cars within a second of each other. In those days, you really only had probably 4 drivers, in Norm, Bob, Moffatt and Gagan, who would be they were the 4 who were going to win virtually every single race. And yet we still talk about that as being the golden era of Australian touring car racing.
That's right, yes. They were fantastic races, and I photographed also all Bob's cars being built. He'd ring me up and I'd go out to John Shepherd's. John built the Tirana with the Ripco Brabham V8, and Pat Purcell, a brilliant engineer and mechanic, and I photographed Pat in these tiny little workshops, almost as small as like Alan Moffat's. Alan Moffat's garage, I went there many times, was very, very small, and it's amazing what came out of that tiny little garage in Malvern Road.
Well, when we come back, we've spoken about a couple of icons, but once again you've mentioned another one in Alan Moffatt, and we'll talk about Alan and some other memories from Ian Smith in just a moment. You're on In Pit Lane, where we will be back, if I can get my mouth to work, straight after this break. Don't go away, we'll be right back. Welcome back to In Pit Lane. We're here with Ian Smith, Australian motorsport photographer, and you mentioned Alan Moffatt. A lot of people will say that, you know, Alan Moffatt really did change the face of Australian motorsport. That day that he debuted the Mustang out at Sandown was really the turning point between the old era of motorsport, the gentleman drivers, the businessmen, and the level of professionalism we have today. What are your memories of Alan and his cars?
Well, I was there at the very first meeting when he brought that Ampol Coca-Cola Mustang out to Sandown. They had a press day, and then I photographed him on that very day. In fact, I think it was used as a centre spread. I saw it on the other day. The photo I took was on Facebook, and everyone's asking who took it. And I even recognised the masking around, because everything was hand printed in my own little darkroom in the garage, and I saw the uneven masking, and I said, that's definitely my photograph. But over the years, I went to Alan's workshop. Lou was his mechanic, and Barry Nelson. And whenever he had a new colour scheme, which he changed quite a bit, Brute 33, and there was the New Zealand travel agents,
the union
for the Americas, and then the Americas celebration, and so each time he'd ask me to come out and I'd photograph it and for the press release, and especially the Brute 33. We used to take it down to Como Park in South Yarra, and we set it all up. And Alan was very particular about the tyre name on the top of the tyre. So the mechanics had to bring down a jack each time, jack the car up, and they'd rotate the wheels so the Goodyear was lined up and could be seen in the photograph. And this happened time and time again of the photography I was doing, and he was very, very particular. And it was interesting though, photographing him, and got to know him so well. Quite often I could get into the pits, and when he's on the grid, I'd zoom in to take a photograph, and he had different moods. Some days he'd say, "G'day Ian, how are you?" Other days I'd go, "Ugh," and you could see his concentration. It varied from one event to the other.
He could be very intense. I remember a Sandown meeting at one stage where he'd had a particularly bad race, and he sat in the car back in the old pits at Sandown for a good 35 minutes, and everyone said no. And eventually, one very small, timid boy went up to try and get it, and everyone held their breath. And he just leaned out and he signed it, and he went over to that, and he got out of the car, and he was right. But he was he really was so intense, wasn't he?
Yes, he was very hot and cold sometimes, and I recognised that, and quite often I'd just see the look on his face. He was concentrating on the grid, and I'd say, no, I won't, I'll back off. And other times it was fine. So, I spent a lot of time with him, and interesting enough, when I sold my business and moved up to Yakandanda, Australia Day was coming up, and who should be the ambassador for the ceremony was Alan Moffatt. And I fronted up to the ceremony, and he said, "Ian, what are you doing in Yakandanda?" And I said, "Well, what are you doing in Yakandanda?" And he said, well, I'm the ambassador for the day. So I found out a little bit earlier that he was coming, and so I printed up photographs of him in the Mustang, which I shot at Oran Park when he had the oxygen mask on. So I did a whole lot of reprints with the logo, Alan Moffatt, Ambassador, AM, and Yakandanda, High Street. So we printed these up, I laminated them, and we invited Alan down to lunch at the bottom pub at Yakandanda and got him to, he went round the front. I said, Alan, some of the locals here would like to, so I gave him a bunch of these photographs, and he went round the whole bar and signed for everyone, and the locals just couldn't believe it. Here was Alan Moffatt in their bottom pub in Yakandanda of all places. So that was quite a memorable event that time.
The thing was that he sort of transcended those eras as well, because it was originally you had Norm and Bob, and then Alan and Pete, and then Alan was still around when you had a new generation coming through, and of course when Norm basically got out of full-time motorsport, this kid called Peter Brock turned up as well. What are your memories of Brocky?
Well, Peter I first photographed, I think, 1967 at Templestowe Hill Climb in the Austin A30, and I've got this iconic shot of him coming up the wall, and you look miles down, you can see the cars down the bottom of the hill. From then on, I photographed him in the A30. I've got some nice shots I took at Sandown and various other meetings. Then the XU1 at Bathurst, probably one of my iconic shots which the advertising agency used. I've got Peter coming around the end of Conrod, and there's a big sign in the background, Tirana the Great, and it was just above of Brocky doing the turn. I think there's another one with Moffatt behind him. So I've got a terrific collection of Peter, and then from then on I did a lot of Holden dealer team photography. Harry Firth would ring me up and come out and photograph engine parts, and then I'd do a lot of work with Peter with various cars, and he was a terrific bloke and very friendly, easygoing. He would go out of his way, greet the fans, and it was. Although one meeting I remember down at Symonds Plains, Bob Jane asked me to go down and do his photography, and Peter was there, and I felt that Bob and Alan Moffatt were sort of sledging a bit with Peter, and I've got this classic photo of Peter walking through the pits, and he had a thermos, and he always took tea. He had his hot tea, and he was walking through the pits, and I think some of the other drivers were making funny remarks as he went by, so it was quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, look, there's so many memories of, we've only covered a very small part. Look, we're going to impose on you, seeing we're here already. Could we take advantage of your time and perhaps come back for a second chapter next week?
Yes, certainly. Yes.
Okay, so there you go. Next week on the program, we're going to have more memories from Ian Smith. I mean, if you're of my generation, so many memories were provided by the work of this man, and we're going to find out more, and also find out what he's actually doing today, because he's still out there and he's still taking photos, and we're going to find out exactly what he's up to right now. Thank you for watching In Pit Lane. We really do appreciate it. Once again, coming up, we're hoping to get back in the studio at RMIT for a new series starting in September. We really do need some sponsorship at the moment to make that happen. So if you would like to help us out there and have your product or brand spread right across Melbourne on Channel 31 and all of our online avenues as well, contact us at advertise@inpitlane.com. But anyway, we'll see you next week. Until then, thanks for watching us. Bye for now.